Hello there, good afternoon to you. I doubt that we will see hide nor hair of the Assads for some time. We are reliably informed that they are in Russia now under the protection of Vladimir Putin. I want to focus in on the wife of Bashar al-Assad and just the couple themselves because of their very close links to this country. She is a British citizen. He trained here as an ophthalmologist and worked here as an ophthalmologist. I think at Moorfields Eye Hospital, if I'm not mistaken. And clearly she has family here still and deep connections to the place. She graduated from King's College in London with a degree in computer science and French literature. She had a career in investment banking, was planning to move to the United States to go to Harvard University when she married Bashar al-Assad instead in December of 2000. So they've been married for almost 25 years. She is, she was completely aware. She couldn't have been anything but completely aware of the nature of the regime that she was part of the country that she was living in. I mean, like Bashar al-Assad, she may have told herself, and we all tell ourselves stories, don't we, to make things make sense, but she may have told herself the story that her husband was saving Syria from vicious jihadism. But that certainly wasn't the nature of the early revolution in Syria. But it was always the mantra of this particular Alawite regime, this particular Syrian regime. We've known for ages how cruel they are. We've seen it in how they conducted that war. We've seen it in what they allowed Russia to do in that war. We've seen it this weekend in those prisons. I talked yesterday about the Syrian refugee I met in Jordan who showed me his wounds from torture in one of those prisons. So we knew the cruelty. So she must have known the cruelty. And there's some debate now as to whether she could be deemed to pose a national security risk if she were to come to Britain. Again, I doubt she will. I'm not sure they'll be travelling much, will they, at the moment, just keeping an extremely low profile in some Russian Dhaka somewhere with their children and their wider family, no doubt. But what do you think about her, and on a number of fronts, really? The national security question, whether she should retain, she has multiple citizenships, whether she should be allowed to retain her British citizenship, whether it could be taken from her. You compare it to the case of Shamima Begum, and who was a child when she was arguably radicalised to go and join Islamic State and become an ISIS bride, so-called. There's been no sympathy shown to her when it comes to her capacity to return to the UK. Should the same hard line be taken against Asma al-Assad? And how do you read her culpability in all of this? Is she as culpable as her husband? Should Britain even think of allowing her to retain her British citizenship? 0345 6060 973. Before I get to your calls, I'm joined by Sir Mark Lisle-Grant, former UK ambassador to the UN, who was also Britain's national security advisor. Good afternoon to you.
Good afternoon, Sheila.
On that question of security, national security, is it legitimate to ask questions about whether she's a security risk to Britain?
I don't think myself that she would pose a security risk if she were to come here, but I think, as you said, it's extremely unlikely that she will do so. I wouldn't consider her to be as culpable as her husband, who was the president, but nonetheless, she was fully aware of what was happening in Syria and did very little to stop it. Actually, when I was ambassador in New York, my wife, Sheila, and the wife of the German ambassador wrote an open letter to Asma al-Assad, which was published in the Times and in German newspapers, asking her to restrain her husband from the sort of brutal repression that he was carrying out against, at that point in 2011, was sort of peaceful demonstrations against his regime. Of course, she didn't respond or do anything about it. So, of course, she must be considered culpable by association, as her husband was, but I don't think if she were to come to UK, she herself would pose a national security threat, no.
I didn't know about the letter you just described there. It's interesting, isn't it? Because there is a long history of cruel dictators and even more benign leaders, using their attractive, kind, pretty wife who adores children and looks great in a gown, for their political ends and for their own self-image as well. There's a long history of that. And she certainly tried to inhabit that space, didn't she, as First Lady, I guess, of Syria.
Yes, and if there was any response to the letter, it was that the following week, both the Assads were seen to be visiting children in hospitals in Damascus, doing the sort of outreach to the public that actually they do very little of before that in Syria. So yes, look, she took her decision. She married Assad, and she became part of the regime. And as a result, she has been sanctioned by the UN, by the
EU.
European Union. Her assets have been frozen, those that she has in the UK. And I think if she did turn up at the UK, there would be questions about whether she should be put on trial or even returned to Syria to face justice.
What kind of justice? I mean, would it just be by association? What would you be charged with? Accessory?
Would be The difficulty is, as we're finding out, incidentally, with the other British people, because we shouldn't forget, I mean, the focus of your conversation is on Asma, Assad, understandably, but there are something like 60 British nationals in camps or prisons in Kurdish-held territories in northeastern Syria, including Shamima Begum. And although the government has stripped Shamima Begum of her British nationality and made clear that she wouldn't be allowed to come to the UK, there is a question about what the government is going to do about all those others. But the problem we've had, and it was when I was National Security Advisor, we had this problem already, was how can you accumulate the evidence in order to bring someone to trial for things that they have done in a situation like Syria, which has been a full-scale civil war battlefield for the last 15 years.
Do you think it's likely that those 60 British nationals will ever return?
I think they will. There's been a trickle of them under the previous government at the beginning of this year. A lot of them are children, 35 or so of the 60, as far as one knows, are children who don't pose a particular security threat. But each case will need to be assessed. And I think the government will need to look at how to manage it. There's been some pressure from the Americans on all Europeans to take back their nationals, not leave them in the region, possibly to be further radicalized, but to take care of their own problems, as it were, by bringing them back into their own home countries.
Are most of them men, or are quite a few?
No, most of
women?
them are actually women and
Really?
children,
Really?
although I think something like 20 or so are men. Some of them will pose a threat, and obviously all of them need to be assessed before they're allowed back into the country, and some of them may be stripped of their citizenship, as Shamima Begum was. But it's quite a tricky issue for the new government to handle, particularly Keir Starmer, who, after all, is a human rights lawyer. And when Shamima Begum was originally stripped of her citizenship, he actually opposed that, although he's changed his mind since then. And a couple of years ago, he agreed with the decision of the court, which didn't overrule the government's decision to strip her of British citizenship.
Could Asma al-Assad's British citizenship be stripped in absentia? Can that happen?
Yes, absolutely it can. That's what happened to Shamima Begum. She claimed that she wasn't able to represent herself in court, but, and that was the reason, one of the reasons for her appeal, but that appeal failed. I think the same would apply to Asma Assad. So in theory, she could be stripped of her British citizenship in absentia as well. And particularly given that she has another nationality, she's obviously got Syrian nationality as well, and she has now been given political asylum in Russia, it's actually an easier case in legal terms than it was for Shamima Begum.
Why? Why is it easier?
Well, because one of the difficulties of the decision with Shamima Begum was, did she have another nationality? Because it's under
Because her
international
father is
law.
Bangladeshi, isn't he?
Well, exactly. And the Bangladeshis said, well, actually she doesn't naturally have Bangladeshi citizenship just because her parents were Bangladeshi, and that was the part of the dispute. But with Asma Assad, of course, that wouldn't be a problem because she has got both Syrian nationality and now political asylum in Russia.
Born at the Cromwell Hospital. No, sorry, no, born in London to a father who was a doctor at the Cromwell Hospital, his wife, a retired diplomat, both of Syrian origin from the city of Homs. So she has deep Syrian connections, which I guess is why she ended up where she ended up. There is something jarring, though, isn't there? And this is always the case if you look at history of atrocities. And there's something very jarring about... I'm just looking at a description of her life here. You know, went to Twyford Church of England High School, Queen's College, London, then on to King's, first class honours, you know, public life, personal life, all of that stuff that you'd see online. There's something jarring about that. And yet, you know, having your image on the front cover of Vogue and a beautiful feature written about you, describing you as the rose of the desert, while people are languishing in their tens of thousands in Syrian prisons. Millions are being forcibly or forced to leave the country because of the war. And you sit pretty, literally and metaphorically. And there's something very jarring about that, isn't there?
Yes, there is. I mean, of course, many British women and indeed men marry foreign leaders. You can think of Jemima Goldsmith and Imran Khan in Pakistan is a good example. The King of Jordan has a British wife. So it's not sort of unusual. What's unusual and, as you say, jarring is that someone who was brought up in Britain with that British education was just sat
sorry,
by
the jarring thing wasn't
and
the marriage.
allowed her husband
Just to be clear, the jarring thing
oppress
wasn't the marriage. The jarring thing is the background of the individual. And then you think, God, what? How could you sit on your hands and be surrounded by your
Yeah.
Louis Vuitton bags and clothes and everything while this is happening?
Absolutely, and that there's absolutely no evidence that she tried to restrain her husband in any way whatsoever. And indeed, some reports that it was the reverse, that she was just as, enthusiastic about what he was doing as he was. Now, I don't know the truth of that, but yes, you're absolutely right. It is extremely jarring.
What's your sense of how this will play out from their perspective? That there will presumably be attempts to bring him to justice in the international courts, will there?
Yes, I think there's quite likely to be movement in the International Criminal Court, maybe to issue an arrest warrant against him and indict him there. Syria isn't a member, as far as I remember, of the International Criminal Court, and therefore doesn't necessarily accept the justice arrangements there. But the new Syrian regime could reverse that and say, yes, we are prepared to accept the jurisdiction of the International Criminal Court as a way of bringing Bashar al-Assad to justice. That is a possibility. I mean, I think one has to be realistic that once they're in Moscow, they're likely to stay in Moscow and they'll be beyond the reach of any international court or any national court for the foreseeable future.
Very different kind of life, though, isn't it? To be forever
Well,
exiled.
it is.
And an awful lot of people have experienced the same from Syria, haven't they? Exiled from Syria, but not quite in the luxury and safety that they are.
Oh, I mean, I don't know what conditions are like in Moscow, and no doubt they're missing the sort of luxury they had in Damascus. But I think President Putin will be treating them reasonably well. But of course, they find it very difficult to travel anywhere around the world. And that goes for Asma, her children, as well as Bashar al-Assad himself.
Because their
So it
children,
is a sort of gilded prison, perhaps.
their,
is
ch-
the
their
best
children
way
are
to
young
put it.
adults, aren't they? Now, very young.
Yes.
Late
Yeah.
teens, young adults. Tough for them. Very tough for them.
Yeah, very tough for them.
Doors
I don't
closing
think
all
they
over
have
the
British
world.
nationality. I think they're all Syrian nationals. And there's no suggestion that they were involved in any of the sort of tyranny of their father, but nonetheless, they're going to be tainted by that association, undoubtedly.
Thank you very much indeed. Good to talk to you, Sir Mark Lyle-Grant, former UK ambassador to the UN, who was also Britain's national security advisor.